So let me tell you about the program you're sitting in. I've had the fantastic opportunity of having colleagues and friends in South America, including Paulo Freire, and in Europe, both of whom very much subscribe to liberation theology and liberation psychology and critical psychology. It's not a very popular framework in the United States because we do that other kind of psychology here. So I'm going to tell you our enactment of critical psych, and as I said, I can tell you the things we're sure about, the things we're growing toward, and the things that we humbly engage with a lot of questions. Here are the three things that we're sure about. We're sure about three different definitions of critical. For us, critical signals a strong interest in history and theory. And for us, theory includes classic psychological and social theory, but critical race, feminist, queer, and disability and indigenous theory. So our students learn all that, and we swim in those waters. And take seriously the knowledges that come from critical theories, which in some ways at their core are all challenging notions of power, what's been given, what's been colonized, and liberation. So that's my first strand here. And inside critical theory, as we do it here, is both a critique of what is, but also an imagination for what could be. Drawing from both Du Bois and Maxine Greene. Du Bois I sleep with a lot in my bed, and Greene I got to snuggle with and touch a lot as she died. So your work on touch is really touching, I guess. So that's the first version of critical. Second version of critical is critically engaged in the world. We're very lucky that in our program, people are deeply immersed, as I said, in history and theory, but also multiple methods and big engagements in the world. So whether that's police brutality or understanding the life of an immigrant queer young person living in a homeless shelter. So the unit of analysis doesn't matter. The unit of data collection doesn't matter. The unit of analysis does. So you can analyze a movement, a history, a structure, an institution, or a life. You can collect data from all of those, but the analysis has to grow for us from what I talked about last night, a kind of critical bifocality. That is a commitment to understanding history and structures as well as lives. Because if we study history and structures, we end up with kind of over-determined stories of oppression that are really important. It's not the same. I mean, hopefully some of you were not exactly what you were supposed to be, right? So lives are squirmy. They say, oh, that hurt, and I'm gonna create something else, right? So I'm always torn between structural analyses that demonstrate the damage and the oppression and lives of possibility. So I'm not so interested in the damage stories, I am interested in the oppression stories, but also the pushback and the resistance. So that's the second enactment of critical for us, that we're involved with big questions in the world, but you can study it for life, which is why Jason teaching the study of lives in our program is so important. Or you can study it through social movements. Other people teach that. The third enactment of critical, which is probably the most popular, but for us the least engaged, is critique of psychology. It's really important we read it all. I just don't have time for us to do it. It's not my big project to critique a discipline that I kind of treat like a carcass or an old friend or a dead plant that keeps growing new funky leaves. And so, I was raised by more Deutsch who was the student of Kurt Lewin, so I consider myself a Lewinian grandchild. And, I did a laboratory experiment for my dissertation. I know everything that's wrong with that. I kind of love doing it. I love just controlling everything, creating an injustice, altering a few conditions, and seeing how quickly people justify injustice as though it's fair, even when there are no stakes. So I never really want to do another experiment, but I'm kind of glad I did it. So it was frightening. So that's what we mean by critical. That I know for sure. Some of the commitments, particularly epistemological commitments in our program, raise up important questions about where does expertise live. In our program, we have a pretty strong sense that expertise is shared, that everybody's got a standpoint, knowledge. Some kinds of expertise are legitimated, academics, PhDs. We challenge that notion. There are things I know based on my experience and my credentials, but there are things that the women who clean this building know that I don't know. So whenever we create research teams, we create what Maria Torre calls a contact zone, so that the people who are most intimately affected by and transforming the injustice that we're interrogating are at the table as researchers, using what Sandra Harding calls, and Don Haraway call strong objectivity. That is, I actually don't want to relinquish notions of objectivity or validity to more traditional social sciences, because I don't think that's objective. I don't think what we do is objective. But Haraway has given us this notion of strong objectivity, where very different people come together to talk about what's the issue from our varied points of view, and can we craft a question that grows at that funny little Venn diagram center. So if it was somebody from the evangelical community, and somebody from the army, and somebody from New Orleans, and we all came together and said, is it possible for us to look at religion and patriotism and music? And the ways in which some groups are honored for their knowledge and others are, could we come up with a question? So we do that in a women's prison. We've done that on looking at the impact of college on the women, their children, in the prison environment. Research team, we're 10 incarcerated women and 7 of us not. In the South Bronx, when we study aggressive policing, we've got teenage young men of color who have just grown up policed. But we also have a former correction officer on the team. We have a grandmother who's been taking pictures of kids in the neighborhoods getting beat up for years. We have researchers, we have lawyers, and together we pool our knowledge, understanding that we each bring something different. No fantasy of sameness. Clear recognition that some of us get seen as experts and others as biased, or refusal to engage those dichotomies. And we ask each other's hard questions, like, what do you do with the terrorism that the United States produces, right? So we dare to create a space where, and do women participate in those evangelical, like, we dare to create a space where we can come together and critically engage hard questions. And we read each other's worlds. Some people will bring spoken word, some will bring rap music, some will bring scholarly articles, some will all look at, how's the newspaper talk about aggressive policing? How is it always that a thug is being shot? How did we end up with thug as the category?
Michelle, can I just ask you a quick, do you mind if some of what you're saying gets sent out on social media? So if we tweet out some of your direct quotes?
My email and underwear are on my website. I give a shit.
All right. I just want to ask.
Don't tweet that one.
This guy doesn't know the story, but everybody else does.
Sounds good.
My emails have been foiled by
Over dinner.
corporate and reformers who are taking over Newark. Those very same things. So,
Wow.
whatever.
All right.
Let me ask you, so this is like a participatory research?
A lot of what we do here is participatory, but we call it critical participatory because we don't want to sound like all those people say, get 6 kids and give them a camera. Or let's everybody sit together at a table. We try to sit together, but we think a lot about power. And there are now folks who are saying, you know what, I like you, I like you, I like you, but I got to go back to my community. I don't want to create a contact zone, right? Friends have done work with Palestinians and Jews in Israel, and hey, man. And, you know, sometimes Palestinians say, this is great, I got to go home and do work at home. So, and I feel like we're at a very fragile moment in intergroup relations where, and that feels very painful, horrible, but just sad to me, because I feel like we've had like 20 years of imagining we could all sit around tables together doing this work. And I feel like lots of groups are going home and saying, I can't trust much right now. Or you got to work triple hard to prove that white is not just colonizing, shooting, school closing, gentrifying. So it feels like everybody's walking in the shadow of their categories, and we've got work to do to demonstrate enough reason to trust each other. At least for me, it used to feel a smidge easier, and so I think the critical questions we ask in all of our work is whose knowledge counts. To what extent are those who are most intimately affected by the experience at the center of shaping the research question? Who owns the data? So when we leave a participatory project, a lot of times the community-based organization keeps the data. And then how do the ideas that we've cultivated together move into public circles, whether that's through social media, whether that's through lawsuits, or testimony, or scholarship, or performance. So we've done a lot of young people collecting data on disenfranchisement from and desire for education, or justice, not just criminal justice. They collect a lot of data. We do what's called stats in action, where we do quantitative analyses live with groups like around Yankee Stadium on aggressive policing. So we have grandmothers and kids and neighborhood people, and we bring the data and we run live analyses of the data. It's mostly Brett Stout's work. And it's funny, kids who are failing math in high school can really learn how to do a crosstab by race and stop and frisk like that. Because when the data speak back to you, and Regina and I were talking about this, most of my work is both quantitative and qualitative, and we've actually done a lot of critical big data work, critically analyzing charter school data, critically analyzing stop and frisk policing data, critically looking at health disparities, but not by group, by structural opportunities, right? I guess the last thing I want to say is the other thing that we do a lot of in the name of critical is work with folks who can help us think about how to shift the dominant frames that are kind of over-determining the stories that are being told. And in the language of Arundhati Roy, how do we tell a different story than the story we're being brainwashed to believe? So how do I let the world know about the amazing women I've met at Bedford Hills Women's Correctional Facility? How do we tell a different story of Freddie Gray, of all those young men who have been shot down, where the story ends up in their lane, right? And maybe even how do we tell a different story of what it means to be policing in these days, right? Rather than the good guy, bad guy. How do we tell a different story about schooling without sounding like we're justifying bad schools by saying you shouldn't close them in Newark or Chicago, even though they're shitty. And for 30 years I've been writing about how shitty they are, but you close them and you disenfranchise a community and you say that's for that community. That's really disingenuous. So how do we tell those complicated stories? And that's where I think the social media piece is so important. There's a woman named Gretchen Susie who graduated from the program that Greg was in, who's going to be joining the Public Science Project on some shared projects. She's been working with journalists on journalism and race and how to tell different, more complex stories about race and racism. They've been doing a lot of work, and they were so beleaguered during Ferguson and Baltimore and Staten Island that the same tropes just getting, the only one who was celebrated as a good guy was that mother in Baltimore who was beating up her son, and one can understand that, but she wasn't exactly the hero we all needed, and yet that's what was getting reproduced. So when I think of social media, Moscovici, I think some key elements are critique, power, but also possibility. It does feel to me like if you're earning a PhD, you have an obligation to circulate images of what's possible. Because I'm in too many neighborhoods, wealthy and poor, where people can't imagine a safe neighborhood without a million cops. And they can't imagine a good school without too much testing. And they can't imagine trusting people until something bad happens, rather than surveilling people so that bad things happen. And so it does feel like it's our work. And like I want to say to you, when you graduate, you have an obligation to start imagining possibilities, not naive ones, not ones that sell folks out, but thinking through the intimate touch. I'm going to use touch because I love it so much now that you've given it to me. The intimate touch of, of critique and possibility, rather than denying one for the other. In psych, we either have crappy stories of damage, oh my God, women have internalized stereotypes, and gay people are self-hating, and black people are self-hating, and it's not a very helpful trope, but we've got that. Or we've got, oh my God, they're so resilient. Black disabled lesbians are so resilient, and there's no problem in the world. And it's like, really, and I hate and love both of those. So we need a way to create a different kind of conversation.
So can I jump in for a second here? Because, I'm going to tell you something. When you talk about critical, how you reinvented this, or your enactment of there. So you're not really like the Frankfurt School in critical theory. The armchair sort of, theorist, right? What is really amazing about all of this is how applied this is, and you're really applying this and doing things with it. So there's that component to it. And then the other thing that comes to mind is you mentioned Moscovici, and Moscovici talks about the thinking society. And he talks about minority influence. And his whole thing is not, how we internalize things, but hey, there's a vibrant little group here that is organizing and talking back to its society and trying to do something with it. And it almost seems like, that's theoretically, that's what you're doing, but then perception, right? Because with your research and what your students do, it's really allowing the rest of us to perceive a different world, and to perceive that world is not monolithic, that world is not one-sided, and that there are all these other points of views, right? And so what it's ultimately perception, because you open up imaginative landscapes for us to see what is going on, and that's quite a noble role for research, if I might say. But it's your Levinian or Lewin tradition that is really showing here.
A little bit of my mama.
Yeah, okay, all right.
So I always say I have two streams of DNA. My mom was the youngest of 18 and passed away a few years ago at 96. Like one of those 4'8" all-breast women. Did you ever meet those women? They're amazing. So a little bit of Lewin and a little bit of Rosie. Let me just say maybe, yes, maybe. So I don't know that I would say applied. I hate the distinction basic and applied. And I know that's not what you meant. And I don't even know that I would say we're applying our work. We're just engaged in the world. Activist organizations call us and say, would you do a project with us on with LGBT youth of color who are activists? Because one of the things that we've noticed is in the forefront of the prison abolition movement, the education reform movement, the environmental justice movement, the student debt movement, the dreamers are LGBT kids of color. So much for our theories on marginalization, right? And so then all these activist groups come to us and say, could we do some work together? So I don't know that it's applying like there's a thing. It's more like activity theory and engagement. The minority influence is really right. And I think we assume that there is a desire for justice and in everybody. I'm running low on believing that in the 1%, I gotta say. But other than in the other 99%, I'm pretty sure that there's a desire to be for distributive justice and a justice of recognition. Do you know Nancy Fraser's distinction? That is to distribute resources fairly, and we can argue if it's fair, but also to be known for who one is. And we just had an amazing gathering with 150 LGBTQ youth of color, and this justice of recognition is as high as the justice for redistribution, if not higher, right? To be known for who one is, to be what Sarah Ahmed would call a willful subject, filled with will, not to straighten your hair to fit for something, but to, so that's what I would say about engagement and minority influence. And I think there's a commitment to think about perception, but to queer the anticipated, to disrupt what people think they are seeing. I have to spend a lot of time as a white woman living with a man with many children, and I'm working saying, oh, I'm not who you think I am, because people kind of have these conversations with me, and then we're down a path. And Jewish, and it's like we're down a path, and I think, oh, you know, if I looked differently, maybe you would have known. You couldn't have just said that. So there's something about marking. Could we have a real conversation rather than, I don't know if any of you, particularly those of you who are white, if you've ever been in schools and white teachers just tell you things about other people's children. It's a bizarre experience, and it's like, please don't talk to me about I don't know, it's this white on white thing, and maybe it happens in other communities too. But so kind of disrupting, for me it's disrupting fantasies of sameness, that I want to keep asking the questions so that our differences are a resource rather than an easy pass to knowing each other.
It's like electric shock therapy for society. That's what you're doing, right?
Yes.
By the way, what I meant by applied, I wasn't really thinking about that applied basic.
As opposed to art.
What I was thinking is, you know, when people think of critical psychology, it's like, what can I do with that degree?
Yeah.
You know, and I can see where students could go and work in so many different places, is what I'm saying. That I don't know, useful application, or where, you know, social work and, you know, really doing a kind of critical piece, you know, in all these different areas and different places. Yeah. But that's what I mean when you think, you know, what would I do with that degree? But it's open, endless possibilities.
I'm wanting to pass it down.
Yeah, exactly. I actually, Greg, oh, do you want to pass it, I mean, for your students, right? Or
No, I'm just saying they should be able to talk.
Yeah.
But I do want to say our students get jobs, that our students get jobs. If they want academic jobs, they get academic jobs. We've never not had a student get a job. Often in interdisciplinary programs, media study, women's studies, African American studies, or psych and women's studies, or youth studies, or Kemi just got a job at University of Illinois in disability and critical race. And there are a lot of interdisciplinary programs opening up, even though in some ways we're getting more conservative and shutting things down. In other ways, campuses to market themselves or brand themselves are developing these funky interdisciplinary niches.
where we could coexist and ask questions.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you.